Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Dr. Mansoor Khan. He's CEO at Persivia. Welcome, Mansoor.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, excited to dive into a lot of really interesting trends and things happening with AI and approaches to AI. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about yourself and Persivia.
Sure, happy to do that. Myself and my co-founder, Dr. Fazia Khan, started a company called Diagnosis One in 2005, which was based upon a textbook she had written on diagnostic algorithms. The thesis for Diagnosis One was to build what you would today call the cloud-based AI system. But remember, in 2005, there was no cloud and there was no AI. So we built it, what we call the web service, and it was a repository of clinical knowledge that clinical systems like EHRs could reach into and say, here's what I know about my patient, tell me what I should or shouldn't be doing. That company was acquired by a public company called Alere and became Alere Analytics in 2012, about 7 years after the start. We were running Alere Analytics on behalf of Alere, which was a $6 billion public company at the time.
Nice.
And we stayed there about 3 years. And then in 2015, we left to attack sort of the next horizon of value-based care and patient care, which we saw sort of, really started to take off around the middle of that decade. And we founded Persivia, and the thesis was for Persivia was to build a system that would allow organizations that were dealing with multiple value-based care models. So they might have an ACO, Medicare Advantage lives, commercial risk arrangements, Medicaid risk, bundle payments, very complex environment, which by the way is pretty much everybody today. Back then it wasn't everybody, but now it's pretty much everybody.
Yep.
So when you have that kind of environment and you're managing even, say 100,000, couple of 100,000 lives, let alone millions of lives, you're dealing with thousands of providers, both employed and affiliated, you're dealing with inpatient facilities, long-term care, ambulatory, home care, and you're dealing with maybe 20, 30 different EHRs, 50, 60 different payer data feeds, SDOH data, HIE data. So very complex data environment, very complex business environment, very complex electronic record environment. And so we set out to build a single system that would address all of these things. So it would do data aggregation and management. It would do care management. It would do quality management, cost and utilization management, and risk management, all based on a single longitudinal patient record that was continuously updated. So that is sort of the thesis for Persivia, and now we are in our 10th year, and just recently received a large investment from Aldrich Capital for the next stage of the growth of the company.
That's amazing. I mean, it's interesting you point out the complexity. Is there anything in healthcare that's simple? It sounds like you're bringing it all together to simplify it, which I think is great. And it's great that you were doing AI before AI was sexy. Like that's really interesting. So tell me, like, how can organizations ensure that AI models really align with the business outcomes, like improved care delivery, operational efficiency that you kind of talked about? And what are some of the biggest challenges bridging the gap between kind of the raw data that you talked about and the meaningful insights that are really needed to impact these business outcomes?
So you just asked essentially a whole set of questions between those two questions.
Yeah.
Let me start off with the AI stuff first, then I'll come back to the data and connect the two, right? So
Mhm.
AI, so AI in the last 3 years really has become a buzzword, right? Now everybody has AI, whether they have it or not is kind of irrelevant. Everybody says they have it, and that creates a bunch of noise. But AI it's not just one monolithic technology, right? There's many different kinds of AI. There's natural language processing, which is a specific set of AI algorithms and capabilities. There's prescriptive AI, there's predictive AI, there's generative AI, and all of these have different use cases. So if you think of a care management workflow where you're first starting with bringing in data, or you're looking at interacting with the patient, you then move into risk stratification, then you move into the actual care management itself, then you move into patient engagement and sort of communicating with the patient, and then eventually into analytics. If you look at that workflow, which is a very complex and very significant and large workflow, in the context of healthcare, and you sort of start mapping AI into that, each one of those steps requires different types of AI, right?
Hmm.
So when you're gathering the data, NLP plays a big role because a lot of the data is unstructured and you have to kind of create structured data out of it before you can start making sense out of it. When you're in, when you do risk stratification, you have to do predictive AI, which is heuristic AI model. It's not the statistical generative AI kind of model. When you're communicating, you need generative AI. When you're trying to when you're trying to sort of identify specific populations, you need predictive capabilities. So if you look at that workflow, you can kind of map one or two key AI models into each one of those steps. And so understanding that is a key, right? Because if you, a lot of times people think when they say AI, they just mean generative AI. And generative AI has its uses, but it can also be very, very dangerous. It hallucinates. Basically what generative AI is doing is matching patterns. It says, I just saw this. Have I in my history ever seen something like this? And if it does, it'll basically say, okay, this is what it is, and this is how I'm going to respond. Most of the time that works okay, especially when you're communicating human to, machine to human, that's fine because any mistakes the human being can cover. But if you start using that to try to, say, prescribe a medication or prescribe a treatment, you could really end up with something nasty. And so, you need to couple generative AI with prescriptive AI for any place where you're trying to make actual predictions. So that's really the heart of using AI is understanding which combination of models applies to which step of your workflows and your processes. Now, none of this obviously works if your data is bad. And healthcare data is the toughest kind of data to deal with, right? It's a mess and it changes. It's a living, breathing thing. It changes continuously.
Yeah.
Providers will document stuff in one place and then they document in a different place. And they change it without telling you. Payers are sending you data. They're asking for data. They make changes to their data feeds or their data exports, and they don't tell you about it. They don't, people start changing the name. So it literally is living and breathing. And of course, things break. So, a typical organization that we deal with, as I said, may has 20 or 30 EHRs, 50 to 100 different pair feeds, as well as HIE, SDOH data feeds, etc. Just keeping track of did I get the data that I was supposed to get from this location, at this frequency or not, can be a huge challenge. And then, of course, if your data model isn't really flexible and kind of all-encompassing, every time a new data element shows up, you then lot of companies say, "Oh, I have to go add a new table to my database to be able to handle this new data," and that obviously causes huge problems. Some of our competitors takes them a year and a half to deploy into a complex environment where we can do it in 90 to 120 days because our data model and our understanding of data is extremely deep, and the team is very, very well versed in all of the different aspects of clinical claims, SDOH, consumer device, patient reported, all these different data types. So to lay the foundation of success, one, you have to understand what models you need to use where, and then you went to what technologies you need to use where, and then you have to make sure that you have the right data to be able to deliver into those systems so they're not doing kind of wacky things, which they're very capable of doing still.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point because even if you're using, more specific AI that's based on data as opposed to generative AI, right, which is more pattern matching, if your data is bad, you're going to still get bad outcomes either way. So that's a
Absolutely.
really interesting point that you made there. In your experience, what makes an AI model like realistic, and how do you ensure that it does deliver the tangible results in real time that healthcare necessitates?
So very interesting question, right? So when I think of the different AI technologies, right, they have different data requirements.
Okay.
If you're looking at a prescriptive AI, which is critical in healthcare, it needs to have access to a lot of evidence-based knowledge. So it needs very specific knowledge because prescriptive AI is heuristic, which means it's rules-based. And so when you're creating rules, you're making very, they're basically binary. Either you meet this criteria to trigger the rule or you don't meet this criteria to trigger the rule. If you meet the criteria, here's what you should be doing. If you don't meet the criteria, here's what you should be doing or not doing or, whatever. So it has very binary outputs, either it knows what it's doing or it doesn't know what it's doing and it's not going to confuse you.
Hmm.
So when we think of sort of this whole complex environment that we're living in, this ability to provide deterministic outputs combined with what something like a generative AI would do, which is then take that output and construct a set of communications and set of interactions around it. That really is at the heart of your ability to deliver useful information to the end user in in essentially real time, because both of these things can happen pretty fast, and now people are used to it. Or you go to Chat GPT, you type in something, and it pops out a response. It might be wrong, but it's very fast and most of the time it's providing you pretty good results.
It's
But I
changing
wouldn't
our
want to.
perception, right? Like
Yeah. And
we did
but
that with
I wouldn't
Uber
go
and
to
Lyft.
it. Sorry.
We did that in Uber and Lyft as well, right? Before
Yeah.
you used to wait for a taxi. Now you have an expectation.
Exactly, exactly. And when you ask that question, it responds very fast, and it may or may not give you exactly what you want, but at least you have the ability to look at it, and sort of for a general question, you can determine whether it's close enough or not. You can refine it, etc. But if you're trying to take action in quick time for the patient, that could have health impact, or God forbid, life or death impacts, then you can't be taking that risk, right? Then heuristic inputs become very important as part of that picture. So that's where the ability to really live in healthcare makes a huge difference, because the general models don't really understand healthcare data.
Mm.
Right. And we have seen that if you ask, so any healthcare specific question, you can get some really sort of, out in left field kinds of responses. So those models, you have to not just have your prescriptive algorithms and your rules, and you need tens of thousands of those in healthcare to really be useful. You have to then map them with training these models in your data, in your on your data model in healthcare. So that training is something that is still owned by the organization that's delivering this capability. And that's very critical for end users to understand that, did they take it, are they just, talking to Chat GPT on the back end, or do they actually have a tuned and healthcare data specific training, methodology set up that ties into their specific data model, so it knows when it's looking at the data what is what and what means what. So that's really critical, and that understanding is, really just now starting to percolate out into the industry, that you need to get to that next level.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. And it's one of the frustrating things for me is when people are like, well, ChatGPT can do all of this for healthcare. Well, for a patient who's researching what to do, they can use it that way because they're just researching. They're not actually making decisions generally based on what the output is. Whereas a doctor is researching to then make a decision. And so they need, to your point, a probabilistic outcome that is based on quality data, not creative thinking to solve a problem. So, I think we get it conflated sometimes when we're looking at the two. I'm sure you've seen that as well.
Oh, absolutely. So, so we talk about democratizing the data, but so imagine a scenario, right, where you have a healthcare database and a doctor wants to say, last year, I can't remember, so I want to find all of my diabetic patients that had a knee surgery and had, and are on metformin and Ozempic, and also have an A1C greater than 9%, right? So I want to pull out that patient out of my local database. If you just stick Chat GPT on it, you'll get total, sometimes you get total nonsense, but any
Yeah.
general AI model is not going to be able to get that information for you, right? You need a highly specialized version of these models to pull that information out, or you need to use an open source model, and that you're trained, highly trained on your data set. So in healthcare, the most useful stuff that you want to do, you can't do it in most cases, you can't do it through off-the-shelf capabilities. You really have to invest in your own capabilities in that specific area with your specific data models. And of course, your data model better be good. Otherwise, you have that other side of the issues, which is if you're missing data, or if the data is misclassified, your results came in, but you did not identify them as appropriately and put them in the right categories, then then even those models can go awry. So it's healthcare is a lot tougher even for AI to handle than than most people would think.
Yeah. Well, I love your vision of kind of this single AI driven platform that you kind of described in the opening. So tell me more about that vision of using the single AI driven platform to support everything from care management to analytics. And then, as you mentioned, to value-based care, which is, you're 100% right. Every organization is diving in and getting bigger every day. So, tell us more about that vision.
So it all starts with that single longitudinal patient record, right? So first of all, you have to have the right data model. We started back in 20 years ago when we started with the previous company. We actually started with the HL7 version 3 reference model, right? Which was
Mhm.
the CDA, the clinical document architecture. At
Yep.
that point, the whole entire industry was in HL7 version 2, right? So you had a lab message, you had an ADT message, you had a pharmacy message, but the version 2 has no concept of a patient, that all these messages belong to some entity called the patient, and there's a relationship between all of them. That was sort of missing in version HL7 version 2, because it was primarily meant for billing, right? You did a lab test, you sent off the test, and you send off a report saying, pay me for this test, that kind of thing. So making sure you have the right data model is the first step of the whole picture. And the data model better be comprehensive enough to handle claims, clinical, as well as consumer and related data. So that's a key of it. If you have that data model, then you've solved one of the bigger problems right out of the gate, which of in terms of taking different data fields and data streams and combining them into a record. And of course, cleaning up all that data as it coming is in a whole set of its own set of problems. But let's assume you solve those, and now you have a single longitudinal record that truly contains your claim, care, clinical, provision of care, cost, all that data in one record for each patient, right? Now you can start doing the kinds of things that are really useful. You can say, okay, my quality scores are bad, so where are my quality issues? I can identify my quality issues, and then with one click, I can say, okay, now I need to take, I have these patients that are all missing colorectal cancer screening, and their A1C test that should have been performed in the last 6 months. So what do I do about it? I need to make that actionable, right? So how do I take that group of patients and in 3 clicks create a set of tasks and assign those tasks to a team to do something about those patients, right? So these are the core capabilities, and you could do the same thing with cost, right? So we had recently had a client in an ACO, and they were, their cost suddenly was shot up in one going from one quarter to the next quarter. Like, I mean, they went from a few $100,000 in net savings to 1 point X million dollars in losses, and they were shocked, like, wow, what happened? How is it that all of a sudden I'm going from savings to losses, right? My population hasn't changed. And when we kind of dug into the analytics, we found that there were 17 patients that were causing, and that entire, $1 million plus loss was coming from, and it's a very small number of patients. And so
Wow.
to identify those patients and then very quickly look at the clinical profiles for each of those patients to understand whether the spend is reasonable or not. If they're oncology patients, then obviously it might well be appropriate for that kind of spend. But if they're uncomplicated diabetes, then this shouldn't be happening. So it could be fraud, it could be waste, or it could be appropriate spend. So being able to identify all of that is what that enables you to do. Now the AI piece comes into it, which is, okay, I have this population, I have the data, it's cleaned up, I'm comfortable that I know what's going on with with my data set. Now I need to make it useful in terms of managing my population, managing the care, both on an individual basis and managing the care on a population basis. So I have care managers, care navigators that are very expensive resources that are very hard to find nowadays. There's a lot of turnover, and there's a big shortage. So I have a huge stress on my organization from a resource point of view in trying to provide the care that I need to provide. I've got doctors and nurses that are providing the encounter-based care. They're living in their EHRs. There's a whole set of problems that they have to deal with, but they need the information that these care managers are generating in real time at the point of care. So you have to close all of these loops. And this is where AI really starts playing into it, right? I mean, we've got clients where we're getting tens of thousands of PDFs a day from, because some of their labs suppliers and procedures, they're not electronic. They're just faxing them to PDFs. So we have to process, 20, 30,000 PDFs every day, run them through the NLP, extract the coded data, and then apply that to the quality measures to make sure that your quality measures are appropriately being calculated, or whether it's your HCC risk score, et cetera. So All of those are really very, very, you can leverage AI to make those resources much more productive and much more, their actions and their workflows much more accurate. So that's where AI, whether it's prescriptive, predictive, NLP, or generative, all of those come into the picture to help you manage those populations, but do it in a way that you're using your resources effectively and not wasting people's time. Uh,
Yeah.
and then focusing on the right patients, right? So the risk stratification piece is the other piece of it. How do you find the patients that you really need to be looking at? If you have a million patients, you're not going to hit those million patients every year, but there's probably 30,000 of those that you really need to be, hitting on every, going and checking on every 2 days. So which are those 30,000 and how do you make sure that you are interacting with them appropriately? That's where the AI really starts to help.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, there's a staff issue. And, I don't think we can scale humans to the problem. We have to use AI and technology to scale to the problem of healthcare. So, how does like AI and your integrated data platform help to break down the silos between physicians, administrators, and how does it unify the business functions under one ecosystem, and make it more AI more accessible? How do you see that playing out? I mean, you gave some examples. I'd love to hear any others.
Sure. So one area where where it really plays an important role. So I would say not just the providers and the care manager, but also the patients, right? Because
Mm,
obviously everything revolves around the patient. So the first thing you have to do is you have to identify the right patients to be interacting with. That
mm,
could be because of their existing profile, or that could be because of some event that recently happened that previously didn't exist, right? The patient had a fall, or the patient just told the providers or the system something new that you didn't know about before. So I'll give you a very concrete example. We're deploying, so we have one of the modules in our system, which is managed by the AI, is the patient engagement module.
okay.
Previous technology that people called it AI, but basically it was they would send a can. They had maybe 50 SMS messages, canned messages. You would send those to the patient depending on the patient profile, and it would be, say, reply by one if you're fine, reply by two if you want to talk to somebody, reply three if you have an emergency, or something
Yep.
to that effect, right? So one, two, three response. So if it would look at the one, two, three, and then basically pass it on to the next step depending on what that response was. We have changed that so that it is now actually reading the patient response, not just one, two, three, but is asking the patient a question and then reading the response, that whatever it says back, to understand the tone and the color of the conversation. So we recently had a case where a patient, where they were transitioning from an older system that did the one, two, three to our system. And so not all the patients had transitioned all the way over. And one of the patients, instead of replying one, two, three on the old system, just replied with one word, depressed. And so the old system just basically ignored it because it was not, key to understand what that means. But we were sort of in that transition period, we were playing the backup role, right? So whatever was coming through, it would be passed to our system to reply. So our system immediately caught that, escalated that to a care manager, and that potentially prevented a significant issue, right? The patient was depressed, but they were able to talk to it. The care manager was thrilled, the client was thrilled, and the
Amazing.
patient was happy that somebody reached out to them within a few minutes to have a conversation. And sometimes all they need is, especially elderly people in remote locations, they don't, they might go 2, 3, 4 days without talking to a human being. So a lot of time, just somebody willing to talk to them and spending 5, 10 minutes with them, asking them how they're doing, makes a difference between life and death, literally.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where the AI really brings together these various pictures, and of course the same sort of applies to when you're looking at care managers interacting with providers.
Wow, I love those stories. That's really interesting. And I love to, hear the impact on the patient, right? And being able to customize it and personalize it for the patient is really interesting. Shifting gears a little, I'd love to hear what key regulatory considerations for AI adoption are you watching, are you seeing, and how can organizations stay agile while still staying compliant with, ever-changing regulations around AI?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. Um, I think regulations still have a long way to go to catch up with what the technology is already doing.
It scares me that they can't, and they probably won't.
I mean, it takes a long time, right? One, the
Yeah.
nature of the beast is that moves slowly, which is, in many cases it's good. You don't want, to be reacting to every change with changing these regulations. But when you have these seismic changes that are really going to upend, large chunks of the world, you
Hmm.
need the right kind of people, and understanding at the regulatory level to be able to make changes that are needed, right? Because there is significant potential for good or for harm. It's a tool. AI is a tool, and depending on how we use it and how we manage it, can have a big impact. So at this point, it's very hard to tell where that's going. I've actually had conversations with some of our congressmen starting back 2 years ago, back in mid 2023, asking them about, sort of, so certainly your average congressman doesn't not understand what AI means. They have some very superficial view of it, like most people. So I'm not blaming them, but the thing is that, now it's a very specialized set of knowledge is required to really understand, and even somebody like me with a PhD has a hard time keeping my arms around how fast this technology is changing. And I've been in it for, well over 20 years.
Hmm.
So for somebody who's not living and breathing this, it's very, very tough. So I think the regulatory question is still a TBD, in my opinion. I hope, we get our arms around it sooner rather than later. But
Hmm.
but given all the competing priorities and everything else that's going on in the world, and especially in the US, it's hard to see how regulations, so unless the FDA or CMS or somebody comes up with regulations on their own, and their ability is obviously limited because they can't create laws.
Yeah.
I think Congress is a long way away from really doing anything in AI that can have. I mean, they could do stuff that can have deep impact, but doing something that's thoughtful is a way until until a much better understanding comes in as to how this stuff is being used.
Well, and maybe that's the key is in the question I said, how do you stay agile? We don't know what they're going to do. I mean, CMS has kind of talked about the label approach. We'll see if the new administration carries on this kind of AI label, like informing you about what the AI is doing, what it's not doing. And I think is interesting and could continue. But yeah, you're right. Maybe the key is stay agile because we're not sure what's coming and it takes a long time to put together.
Yeah. And a lot of it will play into sort of what the data starts showing, right? If we don't have
Mm,
any bad events related to AI, that's one set of scenarios.
yeah,
But
that's
if
true.
suddenly there's a spate of bad news about like we've had in the airline
Yeah,
industry
it'll
recently,
become punitive.
yeah, then it changes the whole tenor of the conversation. But I think it's going to take a little while for it to really flesh itself out, and sort of to separate uh, the good from the bad.
Yep, for sure. Well, we'll see how it continues to evolve, and I'm sure that AI will, and the solutions will continue to evolve with it. As we kind of wrap up, I'd love to hear what would you say is your advice for organizations that are trying to balance kind of the short-term budget pressures that every healthcare organization seems to be facing today, along with the kind of the long-term value AI can deliver, and how can AI maybe relieve some of the burden, the budget burden that many of these organizations are facing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if AI does not do that, i.e., relieve the burden, then you're missing something, right? Then the way
Mm.
you're handling it is off.
It shouldn't be a
Uh,
cost center. That would be
Yeah,
a
exactly.
problem.
It shouldn't be a cost center, right? I mean, the only reason to deploy AI is if it helps you do your job better, faster, cheaper, right?
Hmm.
So how do you go from a care manager handling 250 patients a month to handling, 2,000 patients a month? That's what your AI should be enabling you to do. And to do that, you have to have the right mix of AI, right? You can't just, if you take just one generative AI model and try to apply it across like something as complex as healthcare, sooner or later, I guarantee you're gonna have an issue, and something will stumble, and something not very good will come out of it. So getting a good understanding of sort of what kind of AI technology provides what kind of benefit, and then being able to apply it by carefully looking to what exact problem you're trying to solve, and does this technology solve that problem or not. If your issue is you don't have enough care managers, or if your issue is your doctors are spending too much time looking back through the patient's record, does your technology let your care manager, work with 2,000 patients as opposed to, but because it takes care of the 90% of the patients that don't need anything and, you don't need to go look at it? Or does it help your doctor by providing a summary of that patient that saves them 80% of their time that they might have spent flipping through the tabs in your EHR, right? So those kinds of things is really what you need to look at. And I think organizations are getting more sophisticated and savvy because we're starting to see that level of in understanding and that kind of approach to deploying these technologies. I think we're kind of past that initial euphoric phase where everybody was trying to buy whatever they could get their hands on, and now they're saying, okay, what exactly is this going to do if I deploy it?
Wow. It kind of reminds me, I was at a conference of CFOs, healthcare CFOs this week, and one of the people that were there on stage said, our CFO only wants an ROI, and if we don't have the ROI, then we can't do that project. And then they said something even more interesting, which was, and they hold us accountable to that ROI once we implement it. And I think that's basically what you said. Like, make sure it has an ROI, and then let's measure it and make sure that it does after the fact, that we aren't just, creating fake ROIs on the front end.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Mansoor, this was really educational and insightful. You've been in the trenches for a while, working on both AI, which is its own complexity, and healthcare. I guess you just love complex problems, it sounds like. I appreciate all the work that you and the team at Persivia are doing to help simplify it for healthcare organizations to be able to produce actual results in value-based care and care coordination, care management. So thanks so much for taking time to talk with us, and thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcasting application. Thanks, Mansoor.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.